So, whereas the end of the American Revolution put the country into what was known as the critical period between the Treaty of Paris in 1783 and the writing of the Constitution in the late 1780s, the period after the War of 1812 finds the US ostensibly on more sort of stable ground. And it's going to get the term the era of good feelings. And we're going to explore that, whether it actually should be called that or not. But that's certainly the title that it got. So, it's about a decade from the end of the war in 1815 to the election of John Quincy Adams. And technically, even though John Quincy Adams is elected, it really is sort of the unofficial election of Andrew Jackson, who's not elected till 4 years later in 1828. But when we look at this image, we owe allegiance to no crown. It's interesting because it could basically be from the American Revolution. Like, we're not a colony anymore. We're not part of an empire. We're on our own. But that's really the feeling in the United States at the end of this war. We've had a win and a tie. So it's sort of like we're undefeated against Britain, whether that's 2 wins or 1-0-1, it doesn't really matter because America is really, quote, feeling its oats. Like, we just took on one of the greatest militaries in the world and we didn't lose. Now, obviously, it's basically a tie where nothing changes. But again, there was that prospect of America losing. Thank you, Ethan Renda, and sort of losing that sort of Republican experiment. So, what does the United States have going for it at this point? Well, not only does it have this sort of military, quote unquote, victory, but it's got this upsurge of nationalism. Remember, we certainly had the War Hawks, those young men who turned into scary, scary old men like Calhoun and Clay. You've sort of taken revenge on Britain for hanging around all those years after the revolution. Hopefully we're going to have freedom of the seas. Hopefully now you can sell your own goods and you don't have to worry about Britain sort of constantly dumping cheaper goods into America. But what problems still exist? Well, certainly we've got the issue of slavery, which is really about to really come alive in a major way. And you say, slavery, when did it ever die? Well, certainly that idea that slavery sort of was on its last legs by virtue of the fact of what the tobacco did to the soil up in sort of what we call like the northern South, up in the Chesapeake. And Eli Whitney's cotton gin is going to bring slavery back in a major way in the early part of the 1800s. Other problems that exist is, we did see the sort of states' rights arguments emerging in the Hartford Convention. We know that the federal government, the Federalist Party will really die as a result. But there's, still some resentment from the Northeast about the way that the embargo went down, about the way the War of 1812 went down, and still haven't quite figured out how we're going to sort of bring that Hamiltonian vision into play. He's dead, but John Marshall's not. And Henry Clay is around very much, and he's going to sort of try to make that happen. So we look here, and another image sort of celebration, 1819, really sort of being proud to be Americans. This is July 4th, 1819. So if we want to date it back from 1776 or 1783 or the writing of the Constitution, people are proud to be an American, which means really proud to identify themselves as not European. And that's something that you're going to see in this era. Sort of, we are special, we are unique, we are not European. So we can think about it as either the era of good feelings or the beginning of the end. And when I say the beginning of the end, you can really start to see that timer counting down from 1860, South Carolina secedes, or 1861 when the Civil War starts, because we're going to see a bunch of divisions or a bunch of sort of cracks in that sort of unified facade that's out there. Now, I want us to think about this term nationalism. That's, again, pride in one's country. But what we're going to see here is economic nationalism, which is a bunch of efforts, think Hamilton, to sort of give the national government power and also to bring the country together through economic means. Okay. So one thing that we're going to look at here is Second BOTUS. So obviously you had First BOTUS, it had a 20-year charter. It goes out in 1811. So it's actually out for all of the War of 1812. And it actually proves to be one of the weaknesses of the country. And in fact, Madison, who wrote the Federalist Papers, became really the Democratic Republican godfather with Jefferson, sort of comes around. He's quote unquote refederalized in some ways by the War of 1812. So he's actually going to sign the second BOTUS. So 1816 to 1836. More on that when we get to Jackson. Protective tariffs. Certainly, we saw that with Hamilton originally. We're going to get another tariff in this era. We're going to see John Marshall's decisions. And again, you only saw really one of them in terms of McCulloch v. Maryland in Foner, but I'm going to go into two others. Unfortunately, one involves Dartmouth. We're going to see roads and canals. So certainly we saw that was something that Hamilton could not get done. And in this case, roads and canals do happen, particularly the Erie Canal, but not really the way that either Hamilton or Clay had wanted it. And then we're going to see sort of this overall feeling of expansion that, certainly is born of the Louisiana Purchase. We're going to see a little bit more of that in this era. We're going to see some boundaries getting settled with Florida. It's sort of almost like a Pinckney's Treaty Part 2 in a way. And then up along the U.S.-Canadian border, and then the Monroe Doctrine, which certainly sort of spells out sort of America's sort of second independence. And then we're going to think of something that I like to call the Second Triangle Trade. And it's really important to understand the first triangle trade, not really a triangle, but it certainly, sent African slaves from Africa to the West Indies, and it sent, rum and some other raw materials back to Europe, and then Europe sent finished goods both back to Africa and the West Indies and the northeastern colonies, which again totally is not a triangle. But this triangle trade is going to be very much what we see in terms of our inventions in most transformational invention throwdown, where the reaper is going to send the food, the grain, both to the south and the northeast. The Northeast is going to take cotton from the South and turn it into textiles and send it to the West and the South. And then, of course, South is going to send cotton up to the Northeast. So you really have, grain going two different places. You have finished goods going two different places, and you have cotton going from south to north. So that's really the new interconnected, sort of interdependent market economy. Additionally, we're going to see what's one-party rule. The Federalists are out, the Republicans are in, and then, this whole sort of hoopla about beating the British again. So these are feelings that are bringing the country together. But you also have to ask, do any of these ideas actually drive the country apart? So can an idea or an institution actually both bring people together but also drive them apart? And so when we think of sectionalism, the Compromise of 1820 is something that we're definitely going to cover. It is, in fact, a compromise, which you might think brings people together. But as I'm going to argue, a compromise is never anything but a Band-Aid that is going to get torn off. And in fact, the Compromise of 1820 only lasts for 34 years before that Band-Aid is turned off. Second BOTUS, certainly we are going to see the West hating second BOTUS, just as they really hated the first. The South is not going to dislike it as much, but they're not on board with second BOTUS either. Protective tariffs. Remember, farmers don't like tariffs. Yes, Foner does indicate that South Carolina was originally on board with this tariff, hoping that it would actually help cotton, but it ends up not doing that. And so really they end up being quite upset about the tariffs. Now, roads and canals, again, roads and canals really will benefit certain parts of the country. The South does not like them because they're like, we already have enough rivers. We don't need that. We don't want the federal government being involved. Okay. And then instead of being interdependent, as I indicated with that quote unquote second triangle trade, you're going to have economic specialization. So the South is going to literally call its product King Cotton. Like, our product is better than what you're doing. And the North sort of looks at the South and is like, you guys are backward farmers. We're the true sort of cosmopolitan new America. So even though each sort of plays a role, be it providing cotton, be it providing finished goods, or be it providing grain, each one starts to think that they're sort of the best overall. Now, the Compromise of 1820 is particularly divisive because of slavery. It literally is about where slavery can and can't exist. Protective tariffs, you say, what? How is that about slavery? Well, believe it or not, there is a thinking in the South that if certain types of tariffs that ultimately don't help farmers can be sort of forced down the throat of the South, then what's coming next? Well, in their mind, it must be abolition. And you may say, how do you get from protective tariffs to abolition? It's the psychology of the South, very much concerned that a strong federal government could someday take away slavery. And we're certainly going to see that with something called the Tariff of Abominations in the late 1820s, and then sort of what we call the nullification crisis in 1832 with Andrew Jackson. Now, we've got to think about the economic connections that are bringing the country together. And if we think about that, we got to think about Hamilton. But Hamilton's dead. So Henry Clay is around. And Henry Clay, again, was, a Republican war hawk. But by the time he's sort of moved out post-war, he's really what we'd almost call a nationalist. He is from Kentucky, but he really sees himself as truly sort of a man of the nation. And he proposes something that is known as the American system. It's his vision. It's not one specific system. So at no time did Congress sort of like vote on the American system. They voted on different parts. And I always refer to it as BTN. The B is BOTUS, the T is another tariff, and the N is a network of internal improvements, roads and canals. It's really easy to think about BTN. It's also really easy to think about the fact that this seems like it straight up copies what Hamilton was doing. Well, we need another bank. Hamilton did that. We need another tariff. Hamilton did that. You never got the network of internal improvements. Let's try that now. Okay. So the thinking here is that a tariff would protect American industries. We know that, just as Hamilton said, would also generate revenue for the government. So basically the same idea there. Skip B, not really important. C, let's get BOTUS in there to stabilize currency, because unfortunately between 1811 and 1816, we saw many of the issues that we saw prior to the bank in the first place. We don't want banks making risky loans, and we're going to see the real problem with that when banks just sort of give loans to anybody and those people make bad investments. That's called over speculation, and it causes a panic, is what we know. Okay. And then, of course, this development of internal improvements, which would, again, tie the country together and would be financed by the tariff. So the tariff would not only protect American industry, but it would generate revenue that would help finance this whole sort of transportation infrastructure. So this is Clay's vision. Okay. Now let's skip that. I don't know why I did that. Now, here, of course, is Hamilton. And here, of course, is Clay. Oh my gosh, did you guys see that amazing animation that I did? That's Hamilton. That's Clay. Wow, they're one and the same. So here's really the logic. Okay. Hamilton vision, Clay's vision, very much the same. Protective tariff would create the financial potential or the capital for the internal improvements. Okay, and the transportation improvements would basically mean that we have better roads and more canals with which to send goods by either wagon or by boat. Okay, the better transportation would lead to more industrial growth because, again, as you can move more goods around, you can get materials and resources from one place to the other where they can become finished goods. And then ultimately, this is what Clay thought. He said, okay, the South and the West can now more easily ship their raw materials to the Northeast where they can be manufactured, because we know that's where manufacturing is. And the manufacturing goods can be sent back easier. So he's like, why wouldn't we do this? Why would we not really start with a way to get money to fund the transportation that would lead to more industrial growth, which could lead to these goods basically going from where they need to go, the Northeast, back out to the South and the West. So for Clay, this made total sense, just as it made total sense for Hamilton. Okay. But we also have to understand that not everything is perfect. And even though it's called the era of good feelings, which ostensibly was given really because there was only one party and the Federalists were gone, and no one could be possibly upset if there's only one party, we're going to have a bunch of divisions as well. Okay. And just as I alluded to earlier, a bunch of those elements like a tariff or a bank or, this interdependent triangle trade can very much also be seen as promoting sectionalism. Okay. Now, if we were in class, and again, this is like one of the tragedies of not being able to be in class, is I can't sort of show you what a panic is like. Now, a panic is really, at the end of the day, a financial crisis where everybody is concerned about getting their money out of the bank. So because people don't know what a panic is, I have them sort of act it out. So there'd be one person in each class that would be the designated panicker. Believe it or not, I've actually written letters of recommendation about the designated panicker. So anytime I mention a panic for the first time, be it 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, 1893, the panicker's job is literally to shriek, like throw their books, jump up, okay? And then they're supposed to run to the door of the classroom. And that's supposed to simulate running to the bank to try to get your money, because you don't want to be the last one whose money is quote unquote in the bank, because you won't get your money. Okay. And then you're supposed to act despondent when the money's not there. Now, unfortunately, this person does something a little crazy at the end after finding out that the ATM, this is in another country, so it's not an ATM. All right, we'll skip that. All right. So the action is freak out, run to the bank. And if you're the last one there, you're really despondent. And there are a number of panics throughout US history. They come about every 20 years. So some would argue it's simply just the business cycle, like a sine or cosine, just sort of goes up and down and keeps coming back continuously. And again, we are going to see them every 15 to 20 years. And actually, the math works out really easily. Okay. And I'll show you that in just a second. So, a panic, generally speaking, follows this trend. Investors speculate on property. Okay. And I say speculate because what that means is they're investing money hoping that if they buy low, that land or that technology will go up in price, and then they can sell it and make a bunch of money. But unfortunately, it doesn't always work out that way. So, they take loans from the bank. Very few people ever can sort of start with their own capital. They got to take a loan from the bank. For whatever reason, sometimes economic problems in the United States, sometimes economic problems around the world that affect the United States, the economy worsens. And let's say, that they bought the land for $100 and they're hoping to sell it for $200, but because of the economy, it's down to $50. And they just don't have enough money to pay back the loan. So what happens is that they realize this is not going well. So they basically say, I got to get my money out of the bank. Like, I need money to ultimately sort of pay back the loan, which I can't really pay back, but I'm going to try to get my money out of the bank. And then sort of it's a domino effect. And everybody runs to the bank for fear that they're going to be the last one. This literally causes the bank to run out of money, because I'm not going to go into a big financial explanation, but banks never have all of the money that you put in, because you put in money and then they loan it out to actually create more money in the process. So banks close. And this is the really important part. And again, maybe you take this for granted, but banks are crucial to any sort of successful capitalism, because they make loans to start businesses. So the banks put money out into the economy so that new businesses get started, so that, again, more jobs can be made. So if you don't have banks, you don't have loans, and you don't have businesses, and you don't have salaries. And that's a huge problem. So the greatest problem when we have bank failures ultimately is huge unemployment, because there's not the opportunity to have loans to get businesses started to employ people. Now, again, sometimes history works out really, easily. And so we just got to remember this equation of 9, 7, 7, 3, 3. So starts with a 9, 2 sevens, and 3 and 3. So as you can see, the math pretty much works out to be about every 15 to 20 years. And this panic, which was started by over speculation, really investing in sort of Western lands that went belly up. Okay. But this is really the first time in US history, and again, it's not a very long history, that there's been this sort of widespread poverty. And the government in 1819 and 1837 and 1857 and 1873 and 1893 really does nothing. And the reason they do nothing is there's this feeling of sort of, we're going to make it on our own, and rugged individualism, which is something we're going to talk much more about sort of in the middle of the 1800s. And it's like, what? We're the government. We don't want to enable people. We don't want them to feel like we're going to give them a bunch of handouts. So, it's not our job. Okay. And what's interesting here, and I don't know why it says it must have been from a former lecture, is Westerners are hit extra hard, because during this panic, Botus tells state banks, Bank of the United States, 1816, it got started. It does invest in state banks. And it says to state banks, hey, you guys gave out money to basically people who are speculating in land. Get that money back from them, because you got to give your money back to us. So people out west felt like this, big bad Botus in Philadelphia didn't care about their plight out in the West. And it created even more resentment, which, again, already existed going all the way back to first BOTUS and certainly second BOTUS. What's interesting here is they didn't maybe appreciate that the loans they got originally were funneled through state banks from BOTUS, but they're very angry about it. And that's in fact something that's going to really drive Andrew Jackson's antipathy towards BOTUS, which we'll see play out during his presidency. Now, if you got this map on a test and I wrote nothing else about it, I would need you to identify a few crucial features. One of which is like, wait a second, there's only one party, it's all green, except for it looks like, a sliver right up there near Vermont, New Hampshire that went for John Quincy Adams. Everybody else is going for the Democratic Republicans, who by this point are really going by the term Republican. It is a one-party system. In fact, James Monroe in 1820 comes the closest to unanimity in the Electoral College, except for George Washington. And certainly George Washington was elected by everybody. So we see that. The other part that we have to notice is, whoa, it's 1820. Something really important happened in 1820. Missouri is added and Maine is added. So it's important to recognize that Missouri is the big deal. Sort of Maine is sort of thrown in to keep the balance. And we're going to talk about what happened with the idea of Missouri coming in. So the first state that's going to come out of the Louisiana Purchase, except for Louisiana, is Missouri. And Missouri is going to apply for statehood about a decade and a half after the Louisiana Purchase, so in 1819. And it's immediately controversial because Missouri wants to come in as a slave state. And, again, we look at the old Northwest, and it's close. I mean, it's obviously borders Illinois. The question is this good for the country to have sort of, a pretty big slave state being carved out of the Louisiana Purchase? So I know it says Missouri is the first territory from Louisiana Purchase to apply for statehood. It's the second, okay? And prior to the Missouri Compromise, it's 11-11, totally balanced. And you say, like, why does that matter? Well, the North has way more people in the House of Representatives because it has a greater population. Remember, House of Representatives is based on population. But, no law can get passed if it doesn't go through the House and the Senate and get signed by the president. So as long as the Senate stays balanced and it doesn't actually tip to the North, Southerners are like, yeah, okay, they can't take slavery from us. But if it does ever tip, particularly to the North, then that will be problematic for the South. The North isn't as concerned about it tipping the other way, okay? Now, the compromise is pretty straightforward. Missouri comes in as a slave state, okay? Maine enters as a free state. But the bigger deal here is that there's going to be no slavery above the 3630 line. You may say, well, isn't Missouri above that line? Yes, it's the exception. So basically, the southern boundary of Missouri becomes the line that divides the country, either free or slave. And it's known as the 3630 line. That's the first of about 5 coordinates you're going to have to know. It's also known as the Mason-Dixon line. And it's important to know that this man, Henry Clay, that's not him. Here he is, okay? And I like to play a little song here. Thanks for indulging me, folks. I like to think that Henry Clay has his own theme music. He comes in sort of spinning his cane. He's like, what? You guys need a compromise? Like he can hear you talking about a compromise from miles away and he just comes spinning his cane. Because Henry Clay is going to give us 3 compromises. He's going to give us 1820 Missouri Compromise. He's going to give us a compromise tariff in 1833. And he's going to be involved in what's known as the Compromise of 1850. The one thing Henry Clay can't do is ever get himself elected president. Runs 3, if not 4 times, can never get it done. But he really does sort of bring the country together on 3 different occasions. Now, in bringing the country together by sort of coming up with this compromise, Missouri in slave, Maine in free, 3630 is the line, it's just a Band-Aid. And you could really maybe argue that, a compromise is good for the country. I'm going to say that a compromise just sort of pushes off the crisis a little longer. Now, Thomas Jefferson famously said when he heard that Missouri was applying for statehood, this is like a fire bell in the night. Like this is a coming crisis. And he's actually going to die a few years after this, never seeing it. But he was absolutely right. Once you sort of have drawn this line, you know that the Civil War is coming. It's going to be for decades, but it's coming. Okay. Now, I've shown you this image before, and here, of course, is Alexander Hamilton speaking into John Marshall's ear. And you're going to see a number of court cases where it's like Marshall is single handedly keeping federalism alive, even though it's really a one party system for the Republicans. And the reason I put this in the sort of economic division is because this really is these really are decisions that benefit the Northeast and they don't benefit the West and the South. Okay. McCulloch v. Maryland is something that was in Foner. And really what it came down to was Maryland, a state, tried to tax a branch of Second Botus. So they basically like, you are in our state, you must pay taxes. And Botus is like, no, we're Botus. We don't do that. So the case goes to the Supreme Court and Marshall has to decide, like, first of all, is the bank legitimate? Okay, which really was never resolved. Okay, we know that the necessary and proper clause sort of was used to get it, passed the first time and the second time, but no one had ever ruled on its legitimacy, constitutionally speaking. And then, can Maryland actually tax the bank? Now, John Marshall famously says the power to tax is the power to destroy. Actually, the attorney who argued it, Daniel Webster, said that, and John Marshall liked it so much that he used it. What it means is if a state institution can tax a federal institution a little bit, it could tax it a little more, and it could tax it a little more, and it could ultimately tax it out of existence, which would mean that states have more power than the federal government. And again, Marshall relied on the supremacy clause. And he's like, no, 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 no. Basically, this is the whole idea, remember, that if a state and federal law come into conflict, the federal government wins. So this is really a statement on the supremacy clause, that the power to tax is the power to destroy, and a state can't do that to a federal institution. And he also says, hey, for once and for all, yeah, the bank is totally constitutional. Yeah, I know you guys have been arguing about it, but it's constitutional, so deal with it, which is a huge power that is now officially given to the federal government, even though they'd already chartered two bonuses by then, and also really sort of slaps down the states and says, no, no, no. Federal government is more powerful. Remember the supremacy clause. Now, Gibbons versus Ogden is a pretty simple case where essentially two states are arguing over steamboat rights, New York and New Jersey, and they're fighting about it. And ultimately, Marshall says, listen, the only one that can actually determine interstate commerce is the federal government. And again, this is a statement that goes back to the writing of the Constitution. It already had the interstate commerce clause in there based on what had happened, during the critical period when states were like, had tariffs on each other and there's economic warfare. So again, Marshall's using another important clause from the writing of the Constitution to say, once and for all, the federal government gets to say trade between states. Okay. Now, the last one, unfortunately, involves Dartmouth. I'm not bitter. I swear. It's been like 25 years and I'm not bitter. Whatever. Okay. This is one is actually the most complicated. So before the United States was a country, okay, by a decade or so, depending on what date you're looking at, 1776 or 1783, Dartmouth College at Hanover is created. Okay. So it's now been around for about 50 years at this point. And the state of New Hampshire is like, we want to take it over, basically. Like, we don't want it to be a private university. We want it to be a state university. And Dartmouth's like, no, 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 no. We don't want to be a state university. We want to stay private. So what ultimately happens is that John Marshall rules for Dartmouth, saying you can stay private. And this is where it gets a little complicated. But he says, listen, okay, that charter that you were given by the king originally to start it all up, okay, is like a contract. And a contract can't just be changed by a state. And at the end of the day, what this is really saying here is contracts are the foundation of business. And a state can't change a contract. A state can't change a charter. So it doesn't necessarily like lead to the federal government having more power, but it's really, again, slapping down the state government saying, no, you can't change stuff that you want changed. So McCulloch versus Maryland gives, the power of the bank. It invokes the supremacy clause. Gibbons v. Ogden really invokes interstate commerce, both of which giving real power to the federal government. Whereas Dartmouth College versus Woodward doesn't necessarily give a ton of power to the federal government, but it's really pro-business. It talks about sort of how sacrosanct, how important, how we say how inviolable contracts are, but also says states, you don't have the power to change contracts. So, something that's a negation of the states is actually a promotion of the federal government. Now, at the same time that all this is happening, there are international affairs that are going on, and a bunch of Latin American regions have risen up against Spain. Now, remember, Spain is a crumbling empire. It's really been crumbling in some way, shape, or form since the Spanish Armada, the 1580s. But what happens in Latin America is all these little chickens, okay? You can see them, from a Peru to a Venezuela. They fight off the sort of Spanish imperial overlords and become their own countries. And here is, we've seen, and we're going to see a bunch of sort of creepy illustrations of Uncle Sam. Here he's a giant rooster. And what he's effectively doing is he's so big and he's protecting these baby chickens and keeping these European powers like France and Germany and England and Italy from coming over and really interfering and perhaps taking over these new, what we would call sort of infant republics. So this is, of course, a portrayal of the United States as the protector of Latin America. Now, what's interesting here is it's called the Monroe Doctrine. And this, of course, is, well, you might not know that, this is James Monroe, the president during the era of good feelings. Now, we tend to give him credit because it's got his name on it, where he says the American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization. So basically, stay out, Europe, okay? And we promise in return to not interfere with your affairs, which is a little bit hilarious because we didn't have any ability, one, to keep Europe from interfering here, and we had no ability to actually go interfere over there. But it's really Gargamel, or I would say, oh, you can't see him. There he is, our ugliest president. And before he was our ugliest president, he was our ugliest Secretary of State. This is John Quincy Adams, who will become president in the election of 1824. Of course, his dad was a president, and he was a Secretary of State. Secretary of State is like the jumping off point for the presidency. And he's got a vision. And in fact, he wrote the Monroe Doctrine because he had his eyes on Cuba, of all things, okay? Because he felt that if the United States could get Cuba, it could basically have essentially the gateway to the Gulf of Mexico, which someday could lead to the potential for what we would call an Isthmian Canal that would be able to take you from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to the Pacific, so you wouldn't have to go all the way around South America. So here's John Quincy Adams basically envisioning the Panama Canal some like 85 years before it even happens. So he wants to sort of be in a good place relative to Latin America. And what he doesn't want is he doesn't want any British help. The British actually reached out and they're like, hey, do you want our help, protecting this area, going in on a sort of a joint proclamation? He was like, no, we got it on our own. So when we look here at this cartoon, it's a lot like that cartoon with the giant rooster. And here we have, Uncle Sam bravely guarding the Americas, and who's got Nicaragua behind it, Venezuela, and keeping out all of these European powers. You can't stay out. Well, realistically, this is totally and completely BS because we had no ability to back this up. Okay. So it had two parts, as I mentioned before: non-colonization. You guys can't come over here. Non-intervention. Okay, we won't go over there. And the goals really are to protect the independence of Latin American nations. Also, Russia, believe it or not, is coming all the way down the West Coast, sort of almost as far as San Francisco, believe it or not. But really, at the end of the day, it's not really to protect the independence of these Latin American nations because we're just so into their revolutions and we really care about their independence because we had gotten our own independence in 1783. Nah. That sounds nice. But the reality is we want to trade with them. We want to exploit the relationships. It's like all of a sudden we have new trade opportunities and we want them. Okay. So I like to think of it as a very loud bark by a small dog. So if we were in class, I would find the smallest person and the biggest person. And I would have the smallest person sort of yell out like non-colonization, non-intervention, and then run behind the biggest person, because that's essentially what we did. We were this little dog barking very loudly, even though we had nothing to back it up. Okay. But believe it or not, that big dog that defends us is Britain, but it's not planned out. It's the fact that Britain wants in on the trade in Latin America. And so their ships are always around. So it's sort of like we made the proclamation for countries to stay out, and Britain didn't really do it because Britain didn't really have to listen to us because Britain was still, big bad military, even though we'd tied them in, the War of 1812. So because they're around, it sort of keeps other countries away. So it's like we said it and it came true mostly, but it had nothing to do with us. However, it really does become our foreign policy into the future. Okay. Like we're going to stay out of European affairs and we want you to stay out of American affairs. So as we grow in stature, that sort of Monroe Doctrine, which other countries didn't even really pay attention to because who were we but just a little dog, sort of becomes sort of more and more real. Now, in the end, Russia does sort of recognize that we said stay out, and there's an agreement where we're going to sort of agree to sort of block them from coming further down. I'll show you what 5440 is when we get to a guy named James K. Polk. So we talked about this era of good feeling as a time where the country sort of came together around an economic plan, the American system, BTN. And in the end, the B happened, the T happened. The federal government never actually went all the way in on the N. That was, in fact, only New York State that created the Erie Canal. And I apologize because I didn't talk about the Erie Canal, so I'm going to do that right now. The Erie Canal, connects the Midwest up through the Great Lakes and then up through upstate New York, coming all the way down to New York. And so what that did was it allowed grain, again, from the breadbasket, the upper Midwest, to get to the East Coast much faster. It did not have to go all the way down to the Mississippi, get picked up in New Orleans, come all the way around. And as a result, it produces a lot more money, both for New York and Chicago. And in fact, there are streets in Chicago that are named after Governor Clinton, DeWitt Clinton, who was the governor of New York. There's Canal Street, which reflects the Erie Canal. So in many ways, the Erie Canal makes Chicago into a major city, and it makes New York into a major city. But what it also starts to do is diminish the importance of New Orleans. And we need to start sort of keeping tabs on the South and its pity party that it's going to be throwing for itself, because basically the pity party gets so big that it, declares itself, independent or creates a confederacy in 1861. And the loss of New Orleans, or the sort of growing diminution of New Orleans, is one of those things that is going to make the South more frustrated. So again, we moved from, the BTN, and then we talk about that triangle trade, that new triangle trade, but also at the same time, elements like the tariff and the bank are problematic for certain parts of the country. They don't like them, and they think the federal government's having too much power. And certainly they think the federal government's having too much power, and that's why they don't ultimately finance that network of internal improvements. And then we have, certainly issues of economic turmoil and the Panic of 1819. Then we're going to have in 1820, Missouri Compromise. So the country is coming together, but it's also coming apart. And then we certainly talked about the judicial decisions of Marshall, both in McCulloch and then in Dartmouth, and as well in Gibbons, that give the federal government power, but really sort of at the expense of the states. And then we moved into sort of more foreign policy ish, even though we're not getting involved with foreign countries or telling them to stay out. So that was our era of good feelings. Hopefully, I don't know the time. I'm thinking it's probably about 40 minutes. So hopefully you got in a good 40-minute nap.